Hello and welcome to my material culture presentation entitled Myth, Metaphor, or Magic, the Ruby Slippers in The Wizard of Oz. My name is Pamela Annabelle and I am bringing this presentation to you from Studio City, California. Although we have been watching the motion picture The Wizard of Oz for more than 80 years, we haven't taken the time to concretely explain why these shoes have continued to hold such a fascination in our culture. Our acquaintance with the ruby slippers has lasted over time. Mention the ruby slippers in any conversation or context, and the reference is immediately recognized. Other shoes have been presented to our culture in the form of fairy tales as motion pictures, but none are as widely known or hold the same familiarity as the ruby slippers provide. If we use Jules David Brown's definition of material culture from his book American Artifacts from 1982, we will see the ruby slippers fit his idea of an artifact expressing intentional expressions of cultural beliefs. The shoes could quite successfully be considered as lofty, pragmatic, and illustrative of an abstract idea, which expresses a cultural belief. The exact belief expressed, however, is arguable. In attempting to discover the belief expressed, whether myth, metaphor, or magic, we must ask, what is driving our engagement with the ruby slippers? This question must be answered before we can answer the question of what the artifact is expressing. In discussing what allure these slippers contain, the question arises of whether it is a matter of myth, metaphor, or magic which keeps our culture's acquaintance with the slippers alive. If the 20th century is described as a time where traditional myths are marginalized along with institutions of organized religions, we must ask what events are driving the intimacy with an object that before 1901 did not exist in our cultural memory. These shoes have surely become an icon. If icons are a visual expression of myth, as Nathanson seems to think, the argument for the shoes as myth may be quite successful. The myth theme could be goodness, or it may be having your dreams come true with the presence of faith. If we consider the ruby slippers as a metaphor for either the transition of a young woman into puberty from Nathanson in 1991, or the transition of an agricultural nation to an industrialized one, also from Nathanson 1991, we will note either of these metaphorical arguments could be true. It would be easy for the reader to visualize the transition of the country metaphor, given some historical background. If we consider the ruby slippers as magic, we must ask why we might be drawn to magic. If the abilities of the slippers are magical, and we embrace the story because of the existence of magic, we could use this explanation not only for our relationship with the Wizard of Oz and ruby slippers, but other books and film that contain an element of magic in their theme. Examples of this may be the Harry Potter book and movie series, or Vampire Chronicle books and movies by Anne Rice. All three are plausible, valuable arguments, each with its own merit. No matter what conclusion is ultimately drawn, we agree with Brown. Objects are the only historical occurrences that continue to exist in the present. This is the definitive statement that drives the study of material culture. It is this wonderful idea that history can live forward, for what would we have to study if that were not true? The MGM screenwriter of The Wizard of Oz, Noel Langley, changed the silver shoes in the book story to ruby slippers during his writing of the screenplay. This is outlined in Machin 2005. This decision was a result of a debate on whether silver shoes would show sufficiently in the new Technicolor environment. Red was chosen as a color in place of the original silver to provide as much contrast as possible against the background of the yellow brick road during filming. Materials typical of the costuming department in the MGM studios at the time were used in the construction of the ruby slippers. Kid leather, red satin, sequins, rhinestones, bugle beads, and costume jewels completed the list of supplies required for construction. A prototype shoe of Arabian style was originally made, but a decision by the director deemed the shoes too mature for a girl Dorothy's age. As a result, a plain pump style was adopted. This was taken from Swan in 1982, and 8 pairs were constructed for filming, and that was noted by Trasco in 1989. A particularly vivid description of the shoes. Each shoe covered in red satin, lined with cream-colored kid leather, with 2,300 sequins individually hand-sewn to net, which was then sewn to the satin. Each leather bow had 46 rhinestones, 42 bugle beads, and 3 costume jewels. Red-orange felt on the soles minimized the sounds of the footsteps, was given in the book The Wizard of Oz by Scarfone and Stillman in 2004. A visual examination of the slippers was possible and was done at the American History Museum in Washington, D.C. in October of 2005. A complete material analysis along with close examination, weighing, and measuring of the original slippers was not possible at this time. The shoes are significantly deteriorated, and request for close examination was denied. The results of this artifact study are from a visual inspection of the shoes and photographs taken by the author, me, during the visit to the display. A quantification of weight, length, and materials is based upon secondary evidence from other scholarly work. 6 original pairs of the ruby slippers were a woman's size 5 shoe. Judy Garland was 15 years old at the time of filming and wore a size 5 shoe. 2 other pairs of size 6 ruby slippers were fabricated, and these pair belonged to Judy's stand-in, who was a bit taller and had slightly larger feet than Judy Garland. At least 3 pairs of ruby slippers had orange felt attached to the bottom of the shoe and heel. Other pairs were not fitted with felt and were used in the close-up scenes. The measurement across the bottom of the shoe from the tip of the toe to the back edge of the heel is 8.5 inches. The total measurement from the tip of the toe to the upper back of the shoe is 9.25 inches. The width is 2.5 inches, and the total height of the shoe at the tallest point is 4.5 inches. Weight of the original shoes, or of the shoes currently on display, could not be located. Mrs. Cluett's beading department at MGM Studios was responsible for construction of the ruby slippers. This is taken from Harmet's 1998. They were described as satin shoes which had sequins individually sewn on top of chiffon, and then the chiffon was then sewn or attached to the top of the shoe. As seen in the Innes shoe diagram on the screen, this was taken from Machin, 2005, there are a list of responsible entities for the construction of the shoes. Listed are the MGM Wardrobe Department, the Innes Shoe Company, Western Costume, and Mrs. Cluett's Bead Department. Each had a hand in their creation from design through fabrication. This is a slip-on style of shoe, or a shoe which has no straps, buckles, or fastenings, and is typically termed a slipper style of shoe. This is taken from Rexford, 2000. The term ruby was to denote the shoes were made from or covered in the semi-precious stone of ruby. It is noticed the style of the slipper appears as a combination of 2 styles, one earlier and one later, from Walford, 2005. In 1933, one of the shoe fashions popular for ladies was a health brand shoe made by Crockett and Jones. The style of this shoe is characterized by a blunt pointed toe and a 2 5/8 inch covered Louis heel, and named the woman's Gibson, or court shoe. A precursor to this shoe appeared in the 1890s, a few years immediately before the creation of the story by L. Frank Baum, when the style of shoes were satin evening slippers with flat silk bows and contained beading on the vamp. The vamp of the shoe is the upper portion, which covers at least the front part of the foot. You will note the shoe style did not change dramatically during 1901 through 1939, but there were minor changes in ladies' pumps. The Louis heel became popular during the 1920s and 1930s, although not present on the ruby slippers. Sequins were used, and more frequently beginning the turn of the century, to garnish women's dress or special occasion shoes. For the ruby slippers in the film, the style appears to be a heel and embellishments from the 1890s style shoe placed on the body style of a 1930s shoe. The original function of the ruby slippers was to serve as a costume element in the making of the motion picture. This costume element placed a bright and shining pair of shoes on Dorothy to replace her dull and drab brown, sensible shoes she was wearing when the cyclone occurred. Not only were the shoes a display of shoe transformation upon arriving in Oz, but they served to showcase the Technicolor element of the film. This costume element of brilliance was unique to the time in more ways than one. In 1939, the Depression was still a heavy burden for American citizens. Also, before Technicolor filming, brilliance was difficult to create. From the beginning of the Depression in 1929 until almost the start of the Second World War in 1944, the trend in fashion was for dreary clothes and shoes in various shades of mud. That was taken from Swan, 1982. This trend for the drab occurred despite the popularity of Art Deco style at the time. Art Deco style is typified, as a general rule, by geometric designs, bold colors, and the use of plastic and glass. There isn't any room for dreary clothes or shades of mud in its definition. You can see through the costuming choices in other scenes in the film. These fashion breaks with the Art Deco style are evident. Look at the blue plaid gingham jumper Dorothy is wearing, the clothing and shoes of Auntie M, or the dress of Miss Gulch. Even the traveling Professor Marvel, whom Dorothy visits right before the cyclone scene, is clothed in drab garb. For this particular scene with Professor Marvel, the costuming department purchased several overcoats from resale clothing stores and then proceeded to age the coats further with sandpaper, tea stain, and further abuse to the garments. The perfect overcoat was then chosen. These examples serve to illustrate the before ideology of drab. The change in costuming to brilliant is significant once Dorothy steps into Munchkinland. It is not surprising this is also the transition point in the film from sepia tone to Technicolor. Another proposed function of the shoes were their ability through their design and color and material selection to forward the idea in the story that the shoes were fiercely desirable but useful only to their possessor. This was done not only in dialogue, but first through the naming of the ruby slippers. This placed in the mind of the viewer the shoes being made of rare jewels. The selection of the color red was specific to Technicolor, but certainly was not contained to selection of shoe color alone. There are several examples of red color selections in the movie. Other examples are the sulphurous smoke by which the Wicked Witch of the West appeared and disappeared. That was red in color. the red brick road that runs alongside the yellow brick road in Munchkin Land that leads to the south, and the good witch Glinda's land, the rust keeping the Tin Man from moving, the poppies in the poppy field, the wicked witch of the west poisons, the red bow placed on the mane of the lion during his transformation in the city of Oz, the red sands in the hourglass of the wicked witch of the west castle tower. These additional selections for other elements in the film are consistent with the color choice of the shoes and may have been selected based upon Technicolor technology. However, looking at the examples of red used in the film, a theme emerges. One has to wonder how deliberate the choice of red really may have been. The choice of the color red is not far removed from similar choices in other fairy tales. Thematically, you will find the color red in fairy tales where the heroine is reaching maturation, such as in Snow White, Rapunzel, and Sleeping Beauty, usually arriving in the form of blood in the storyline. In the book, The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is not of an age reaching maturation. After considering Shirley Temple for the part and deciding she was too young, a more mature Judy Garland was chosen. Previous writings with regard to this element of blood in the fairy tale storyline have been thought to refer to menstrual blood. In fairy tales where the female lead is of a younger age, such as Hansel and Gretel or Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the thematic use of the color red is not found. Interestingly enough, there is conflicting information about who the designer of the ruby slippers may have been. You will see from the above schematic design of the ruby slippers, MGM Studios claimed the design belonged to Adrian. Two other sources are in agreement with the design being attributed to Gilbert Adrian. However, a search through the history of shoe design leads to findings of a contradictory nature. An encyclopedia, as well as the writers of Fashion Tomorrow, both state the designer of the ruby slippers was Salvatore Ferragamo. It is not the intent here to discuss at length these two claims. Suffice to say that the owner of the original pair of slippers were MGM Studios, and according to their schematic design for the shoes, the designer of record was Adrian. Therefore, Adrian shall be the designer of reference throughout the remainder of this presentation. Gilbert Adrian did not live a long life, but he lived a successful one. He was born in 1903 and died of a second heart attack in 1959. He studied design at Parsons School of Applied Arts in Paris. In 1921, Irving Berlin spotted one of his designs on a model and asked him to come to New York to design costumes for Berlin's Broadway shows. While in New York, Rudolph Valentino's wife saw his designs and admired them. She introduced him to Cecil B. DeMille, a Hollywood director. DeMille successfully talked Adrian into moving to Hollywood to design costumes for motion pictures. In 1925, when DeVille moved to MGM Studios, Adrian followed. Adrian worked for MGM until 1941. During the 1930s and 40s, he was the most popular Hollywood costume designer and in high demand at the studio. Because the public was very interested in what movie stars were wearing for special events and in films, his style practically dominated American fashion in the 1930s and 1940s. Beginning in the 1940s, his interests started to turn to mass production clothing and away from motion picture costuming. His concept was to design high quality, ready to wear for the general public. He eventually opened his own retail store in Beverly Hills and also commissioned his ready-to-wear clothing at other specialty stores in the United States. This high popularity of the time is also a component in the current reasoning of why the ruby slippers remain a valuable commodity. In comparing materials used for shoes of the same time period, it is found that satin was a popular material for women's shoe styles. According to a chart which graphs best-selling styles in America in 1930, Satin material was one of the most popular for ladies' fancy shoes in New York, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Omaha, and San Francisco in the 1920s and 30s. This selection of satin historically arrives from the 19th century practice in Cuba, Mexico, and California, where this material was a typical part of women's dress. The sequins on the top of the shoes were hand-stitched, one by one, to the chiffon. Placement of the sequins on an outside element not directly upon the shoes allowed the filmmakers to determine which directions the sequins would be lined up upon the shoes for the greatest effect. Sequins were first stitched to a layer of chiffon and then placed upon the satin of the outer part of the shoes. This afforded the construction workers at Mrs. Cluett's beading department at MGM the ability to change the direction of the sequins according to the cinematographer's and director's instruction when the test shots of Judy Garland in the shoes began. The orientation of the rows of sequins directly affected the sparkle displayed in the film shots. They were moved and examined for the greatest effect, mimicking the shoes being covered in rubies. In the end, it was decided a horizontal 45-degree angle best showed the sequins on film. The chiffon was attached to the red silk of the shoe in this manner, including 3 exterior sides of the heel. The interior of the heel was covered in red silk, but did not contain the layer of chiffon with sequins. The bow adorning the top of the shoe is made from a flat 1/4 inch thick piece of red leather. Attached to the bow are the beads, rhinestones, and costume jewels. The bow is then placed on top of the vamp, centered and close to the front edge of the shoe. MGM Studios were the original owners of all 8 pairs of the shoes. It is speculated all 8 pairs remained in the MGM costume department until 1960, when they were scheduled to be destroyed in the incinerator. A man from the costume department, Kent Warner, could not bear to destroy the shoes. He took some of the shoes to his home, the exact number of pairs unknown. It is unknown if he incinerated any of the pairs, but 1 pair was left in the costume department as instructed. He added the shoes he took from the wardrobe department to his own private costume collection until he sold some at auction in the 1980s. It is not clear whether all his pairs have been accounted for. In 1970, a pair was found wrapped in a Turkish towel in the basement of MGM's wardrobe department. They were covered in dust and cobwebs. The pair was sold in 1970 when MGM held a props and memorabilia auction by an anonymous buyer and then donated to the Smithsonian Institution. Currently, MGM does not have any of the original ruby slippers. Debbie Reynolds wanted the ruby slippers for a collection and museum she was starting and made a public statement she would be attempting to purchase the pair in the 1970 sale. She was outbid and did not win the shoes, although she did subsequently bid on the test pair of Arabian style and won those. They were placed in her costume museum in Las Vegas for a time, but the museum eventually closed. Debbie Reynolds still owns the Arabian pair of ruby slippers, although they are no longer on public display. Today, 5 pairs of existing slippers have known owners. David Elkaby, Roberta Bauman won this pair in a contest in 1940 and kept them for 48 years, then sold them at Christie's auction. Philip Samuels, a pair Kent Warner rescued and believed to have been the pair used in filming the scene when Dorothy clicks her heels 3 times to return home. Michael Shaw, another pair of Kent shoes, sold at auction 1988. The Smithsonian Institution purchased at the original 1970 MGM auction and anonymously donated to the museum. And the Debbie Reynolds pair of Arabian-style slippers. It remains to be seen if Kent Warner has the other 3 pair of ruby slippers and will sell them at a later date. The future monetary value of the ruby slippers was inconsequential and certainly unknown to the workers in Mrs. Cluett's beading department at MGM Studios in 1937 when the shoes were produced. Mrs. Cluett's beading department worked on all manner of costuming for MGM Studios, and the ruby slippers were among the thousands of costume pieces fabricated for various films. Given material costs at the time, it can be safely assumed the cost for each pair of ruby slippers was significantly under $100, excluding labor costs. There were 8 pairs made in all, 6 pairs for Judy Garland and 2 additional pairs for her stand-in. In 1940, a pair was won in a contest by Roberta Baumann. She kept these shoes for 48 years. In June of 1988, she auctioned them off at Christie's in New York, and they brought a price of $165,000, purchased by Anthony Landini. In May 24, 2000, the same pair was auctioned off by Christie's in New York again. This time they brought a price of $600,000, purchased by David Elkaby from Los Angeles. In February or March of 1970, a second pair of ruby slippers was found wrapped in a Turkish towel in the basement of MGM's wardrobe department and thought to be the only surviving pair. This pair sold the following May of 1970 for $15,000 at the MGM Props and Memorabilia auction by an anonymous buyer. They were consequently donated to the Smithsonian American History Museum and have been on public display since 1979. The third pair that Warner had taken for himself while preparing the MGM sale in 1970 were sold at a Christie's auction in 1981 by Warner for $12,000 to an unidentified buyer. In August of 1988, this pair was sold at a private auction to Philip Samuels of St. Louis for $165,000. A fourth pair was sold to Kurt Warner to a private collector, Michael Shaw, in 1970 for a price of $2,500. Shaw still owns this pair. The fifth pair, currently in existence, the Arabian-style pair owned by Debbie Reynolds, was purchased by Reynolds at the 1970 MGM auction for $12,000. Although her Hollywood Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada, has subsequently closed, she or her heirs still retain possession of this pair of shoes. Speculation on the prices commanded for the shoes began when MGM held the auction in 1970. Several individuals were interested in the shoes and bid accordingly during the sale, thus causing the price to rise during bidding. Another reason for the prices commanded by the sale of the shoes during this time might be Judy Garland's clouded death in London in 1968. The ritual appearance of the Wizard of Oz movie on television each year, or perhaps the use of the slippers as a talisman, for they are known to keep you safe and also contain the power to bring you home again. The continually escalating price the shoes command at auction further reveals the increase in value to American culture. The reasoning for the increase in value can be argued successfully from a number of viewpoints, whether cultural value, consumer demand for the shoes, or other reasons related to either the wearer, Judy Garland, or the systematic yearly run of the movie on television. The shoes can be divided between body and heel. The heel portion gives rise to the body of the shoe, elevating the wearer. While looking from above, the long opening on the top can be surmised as an opening which requires the passage of a large appendage. If we forget previous knowledge of a shoe, we can deduct that something large fits into the opening, and due to the hard nature of the material at the bottom of the object, we can also deduct this object has a protective quality. If it is protective, it must be protecting something delicate. Which of our body parts come in contact with outside surfaces? This is the question to ask when beginning. Due to the size and nature of the opening at the top, we know our foot will fit inside. The use of soft and pliable materials on top of the sole also suggests something delicate fits inside. The soft materials would be comfortable for a delicate foot. Safety is an issue here, safety and comfort. Wearing a shoe has different meanings for a variety of people. Some would say comfort is of paramount importance. Some choose style or a statement the footwear projects. Value of a shoe is indicative of what a person shows to the outside world, whether they want to be seen as comfortable, a personality. It is a protector of the foot and a symbol of self. The ruby slippers protected Dorothy's foot from the elements and also protected her from the Wicked Witch of the West. The shoes can also be described as a symbol of self for Dorothy, her talisman that will eventually get her home. Myth is said to be a psychic phenomenon, the primary expression of religion or faith, revealing the nature of the soul. The myth of the ruby slippers might possibly be the expression that a force greater than the self is required to achieve goodness or desires. When Dorothy is told by Glinda, the good witch in the Emerald City, that she has the power of the shoes to return home the whole time, faith is the guiding element when Dorothy clicks her heels. Her faith causes the manifestation of her desire to return home from Oz. Although this is not portrayed in an express religious sense, a certain faith is required which expresses her desire to return home and causes the event to occur. Another factor to be considered is the dream sequence of the film, which comprises the whole Oz experience. Jung adopted the idea that dreams can reveal the nature of the soul. This particular idea is evident when examining other fairy tales that contain a dream sequence. Alice in Wonderland has a dream element in the storyline, as does Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Old Shut-Eyes the Sandman, and the Sugar Plum Tree, from Olive Dupree Beaupre Miller, 1920. The myth of the fairy tale is portrayed as a belief in dreams and the ability of those dreams to come true. Contained in the myth of the fairy tale is usually an object associated with the attainment of those dreams, such as Aladdin's magic lamp, or the ruby slippers, or Cinderella's glass slipper, or the apple in Snow White, to name a few. And the object furthers the character's ability to attain the heart's desire. It is interesting to note when a shoe is the object associated with the attainment of dreams, the shoe usually belongs to a female character. This may possibly be because clothing, shoes included, are perceived by some as bondage and are indeed an expression of the vulnerability of the body. This vulnerable aspect can be turned into a positive one if the object is given the power to grant desires. Additionally, the argument the Wizard of Oz is a secular myth has been posed, and evidence to support this theory relies upon cinematic properties used in a consistent pattern throughout the course of the film. The properties discussed are related to style. Material components are said to be constructed in a deliberate manner used as a visual backdrop for the viewer of the film. The idea carries forward the discussion of myth as faith and religion in the discussion of the secular evidence contained in the film. In order to reject this argument, we must look at other evidence contained within the film. The contrasting views presented in the film support not only the individualism valued in American culture, but the explicit anti-secular message, you don't get things from someone else, you get them from within yourself. Metaphor of the ruby slippers can be expressed in terms of psychological development of the individual or as an expression of American society as a whole. Examples of parallels for these types of metaphors can be found for each. As discussed earlier, the metaphor of the ruby slippers can mean the experience of the society as a whole, the movement from agricultural society to industrialization, or of the individual, as in Dorothy's progress from childhood to womanhood. If, in the case of the individual metaphor, shoes articulate our identity and are the mediation between the body and place, we can further our argument of the metaphor of the shoes as development of the character of Dorothy from childhood into womanhood. If the shoes are a metaphor for the psychological development of a whole culture or society, then the progression of the type of shoes Dorothy wears during the story makes sense, from the brown sensible shoes to the ruby slippers. The discussion of the magical properties of the slippers begins with the obvious theme of magic. Whether reading the story or watching the film, the viewer learns the slippers protect Dorothy from the evil magic of the Wicked Witch of the West and contain good magic to keep her from harm. The line, "The witch cannot touch you as long as the ruby slippers remain on your feet," illustrates this. Shortly before the film was produced, Mayor Martin Lotz of Culver City, California, was quoted as saying, "The shoes symbolize everything that is pure and clean in a world of magic and make-believe. There is an explicit message present. The shoes are magical. Magical shoes must be rare. They're carved from ruby gems and have an ability that goes beyond their normal function. These can transport Dorothy back home and must contain an element of danger. The witch might possibly kill Dorothy to get them. The magical properties are of interest to the viewer because the idea of magic leads to fantasy about the viewer's own life experience. This fantasy of a better life exists for all. It is one of the elements required in the belief of magic." We would agree that a Freudian analysis of shoes explores the relationships between the individual, the culture, and the unconscious in the general sense. It is this basis which forms the idea there is a tie between the ruby slippers, the American culture, and the unconscious of the person engaged with the shoes. If these three things are tied together and there is a relationship, the relationship between the slippers, the culture, and the person viewing the shoes should be explored. The culture drives the interest in the slippers, which affects the person viewing the shoes. The first aspect to explore is the culture. The slippers are embedded in the culture. The reasoning for this is an unconscious decision by the culture. At no time do groups of citizens gather around a table and choose which objects will be embedded in our culture. It is more of a developing relationship the culture assumes with the object. The relationship can be developed through repeated engagement with the object or through a traumatic event that occurs around or with the object. In the case of the ruby slippers, the initial Technicolor technology gave the viewer a more vivid portrayal of the story that had ever occurred prior to 1939. Couple this with the fact the movie is shown on television at least twice per year, repeating every year, and the development of the relationship of the culture with the slippers can be understood. The unconscious relationship occurs when the culture has assumed the object as an icon. It is no longer a thoughtful process the slippers evoke. It is automatic identification, and unconscious thoughts occur simultaneously when viewing the object. The relationship between self and object suggests identifiable properties of the slippers are combined with unconscious thoughts. These thoughts are a reflection of the values of the culture. Rubies are precious to our culture. Childhood is precious. Dreaming and magic are precious. All these images are unconsciously evoked when engaging with the slippers. The images are connected to our notion of self as we use them as a baseline to evaluate ourselves. Additionally, the shoes can be an outward projection of self. It is logical to think a relationship exists not only between the viewer and the viewer's self, but also between the wearer and the object presented to the public. If no relationship existed, there would not be a continued interest in the story, the movie, or the ruby slippers. Let us briefly take a look at the biography of Judy Garland beginning with the filming of The Wizard of Oz. It is reported the studio head did not want her physical appearance to change during the course of filming, so she was started on prescription medication, diet pills during the day, sedatives to sleep at night. This actually would have required the collusion of a group of people: studio head Louis B. Mayer, director Victor Fleming, studio physicians to write the prescriptions, and a pharmacist filling the prescriptions. It has been documented this actually occurred. She developed a heavy reliance on these medications, a reliance that lasted her whole life. It is stated that these medications, given to a child of 15, caused mental illness in Judy. Shortly after the film wrapped, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital and administered shock treatment. The theme of drug dependence carried through to the tragedy ending her life. It is interesting to note her favorite color became the color red. A tragic life begets a tragic favorite color choice, or so it seems to follow suit in this particular case. Perhaps her choice of favorite color ultimately came about because some affect or memory from the ruby slippers. The film marked the beginning of a lucrative career for Judy. Perhaps the ruby slippers held personal meaning for her as magic slippers, despite her exposure to the filming process. She may have been able to hold on to the storyline that magic does exist in our everyday lives and dreams. Perhaps it was an unconscious desire to go back to her life before she started the project. Whatever the reasoning, she developed favoritism toward the color red. Evidence exists that thought has been given to the symbolism contained within The Wizard of Oz. In 1964, the American Quarterly published an article discussing the allegorical connections of themes in the film, written by Littlefield. He felt that the trip of bombs to South Dakota in 1887 led to the writing of the Wizard of Oz story. The Populist Party was beginning to form at this time. One of their platforms was that the government should give monetary aid to the suffering farmers. Littlefield examines the stories written by Baum and comes to the conclusion they were political commentaries. In a subsequent Oz book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, Littlefield states it was a blatant satire on feminism and the suffragette movement. Examples discussed in the same article related to the first Oz story were the Wizard as President Grover Cleveland, Dorothy, the good-natured American people, and Toto, the teetotaling prohibitionist. The yellow brick road signifies the gold standard, which would ultimately lead to nowhere. The Emerald City, Washington, D.C., and the ruby slippers, the silver standard. One needs only to examine the history of politics and economic plight of Americans of the time to discover there were many issues ripe for satirical writing. Beginning with that first transformational viewing of the movie on television when I was 5 years old, I am still mesmerized by the film and frightened of the Wicked Witch. The ruby slippers are the reason I watched the movie. They are the object that has kept my attention all these years. Why do I keep watching? To get another glimpse of the slippers and another chance to daydream what I would be searching for if only the slippers were on my own feet. How do they look? Even in their current decayed state, they look magical. Just by mere close approximation, I am transported to another time. I am finally close enough to the slippers I have been watching and coveting for over 40 years. If only I could get near them, I would be stuffing my feet into them as if I were one of Cinderella's ugly stepsisters trying to fit into the glass slipper. This is probably the reason they sit in the museum under glass. Suspicion of people like me. I asked the question in the beginning of this presentation how an artifact could hold the same strength after 81 years. Upon closer inspection, it may be that they hold magical promise, and our ties to the shoes can be explained as the hope of our own lives to hold the same magical promise. Thank you for listening.